In 67 AD, the emperor of Rome held a wedding ceremony. He wore the veil, he walked down the aisle, and his husband's name was Pythagoras. 10,000 Romans watched. Nobody was arrested, but everyone was disgusted, and not for the reason you'd expect, because the Romans didn't think about this the way you do. They didn't even have a word for it. And the thing that actually disgusted them, it had nothing to do with two men getting married. In this video, we're going to find out what Rome actually believed about sex, power, and identity. What was allowed, what was punished, which emperors lived double lives, and the exact moment 400 years later when everything changed forever. By the end, I promise you will never look at Rome the same way again. To understand Rome, you have to throw out almost everything modern culture has taught you. We live in a world that divides people into categories: straight, gay, bisexual. These are identities. They describe who a person is attracted to, and we treat them as fundamental to who someone is. Rome had none of that, not because Romans were more enlightened or more primitive, but because they were asking a completely different question. Rome didn't care who you slept with. Rome cared about what role you played. The Roman world ran on a single obsession: dominance. Who was on top? Politically, militarily, socially, and yes, physically. A Roman man was expected to be active, dominant, in control. That was what it meant to be a man. That was what it meant to be Roman. There was a Latin word, vir. It meant man, but it also meant strength, virtue, power. To be a vir was to be someone who imposed his will on the world, a man who dominated, and on the other side of that equation was the passive role. That was for slaves, for foreigners, for prostitutes, people who existed in a lower position in Roman society, people who, by definition, were acted upon rather than acting. So when a Roman man slept with another man, if he was the dominant partner, there was no scandal, not morally, not legally. The gender of his partner was almost irrelevant. What mattered was his role. What mattered was that he was the one in control. This is why Rome produced art, poetry, and literature celebrating what we would call same-sex relationships without any apparent shame. The poet Horace wrote about it. Virgil wrote about it. Emperor Hadrian built a city about it, but we'll get to him. The law reflected this. There was one Roman statute that touched this subject, the Lex Scantinia. And historians have debated for centuries exactly what it said. But the clearest interpretation is this: it did not criminalize sex between men. What it criminalized was violating a freeborn Roman citizen, male or female. And it criminalized a freeborn Roman man taking the passive role, not because of who he was doing it with, but because he had degraded himself, because he had abandoned his status as a vir. That was the Roman crime. Not love, not desire, losing your place in the hierarchy. So what actually got you in trouble in Rome? The answer is anything that disrupted the social order. If you were a senator and it became known that you had taken the passive role, your career was over, not because of a law necessarily, but because of something called infamia. Infamy. A loss of social standing so complete that it stripped you of your ability to hold office, to speak in court, to be treated as a full citizen. Actors had infamia. Prostitutes had infamia. Gladiators had infamia. And a freeborn Roman man who submitted, he earned infamia too. There were real court cases, real prosecutions, men dragged before Roman courts not because they had slept with another man, but because they had done so in the wrong way, with the wrong person, in a way that violated someone's status. Slaves had no protection. A Roman master could do whatever he wanted with his slaves, male or female. That was simply property law. The slave's experience was irrelevant in the eyes of Rome. Prostitution was legal and visible. Male prostitutes worked alongside female ones. They paid taxes. They were regulated, but they carried infamia. They had surrendered their dignity, and Roman law acknowledged that by stripping them of legal standing. The military had its own stricter code. Soldiers were held to a higher standard of masculine conduct. A soldier who was found to have taken the passive role could, in theory, be put to death, not for immorality in the modern sense, but for being unfit for war, for being unfit to be the kind of man Rome needed. So the picture that emerges is not one of tolerance in any modern sense. It was more brutal than that. Rome created a world where your sexual behavior was a direct reflection of your place in society. The powerful could do nearly anything. The powerless had no choices at all, and anyone in between who stepped out of their assigned role paid a severe price. That is the Rome that Nero ruled when he walked down that aisle in a veil. And now you understand exactly why Romans were horrified, not because he married a man, but because he submitted. Now let's talk about the men at the very top of Roman society, because the emperors, the men with absolute power, men answerable to no one, lived in ways that reveal everything about what Rome actually believed versus what it publicly preached. Julius Caesar start with Caesar. Before he was dictator, before he crossed the Rubicon when he was a young man serving in the province of Bithynia, he spent an unusually long time at the court of King Nicomedes IV, long enough that rumors started. The whispers were that Caesar had been the king's lover, and not the dominant partner. His enemies never let him forget it. They called him the Queen of Bithynia. When he returned from his military campaigns in Gaul with his army, his own soldiers sang songs mocking him, calling him every woman's husband and every man's wife. It was the worst thing a Roman soldier could say about his general, not that he had slept with a man, that he had submitted to one. Caesar laughed it off. He had to, because the accusation, if believed, would have destroyed him, not for loving a man, but for having once been less than a vir. Nero, which brings us back to Nero. And now the wedding makes complete sense. Nero held 2 public wedding ceremonies with men. The first was with a freedman named Pythagoras. Nero wore the veil. Nero was the bride. The second was with a young man named Sporus, whom Nero had castrated because he resembled his dead wife, Poppaea. Romans were disgusted. The historian Suetonius recorded it with barely disguised horror, but read Suetonius carefully, and you notice something. The disgust isn't simply about 2 men, it's about Nero's role, an emperor, the most powerful man in the world, wearing a veil, taking the passive position, submitting. That, to Rome, was obscene, not the men, the submission. Hadrian, and then there is Hadrian, Oswiniefopor, and Wesed. And this story is different. This story is almost modern in its emotional weight. Hadrian was one of Rome's greatest emperors. He built the wall in Britain that still bears his name. He consolidated the empire, reformed the military, commissioned the Pantheon. He was disciplined, intellectual, powerful, and he was completely, devastatingly in love with a young Greek man named Antinous. Antinous traveled everywhere with Hadrian. He was the emperor's constant companion for years. Roman society accepted this. Hadrian was clearly in the dominant role. Antinous was a Greek of lower status. Everything was in its proper place. And then in 130 AD, Antinous drowned in the Nile. The circumstances have never been explained. Accident, suicide, murder, we don't know. What we know is what Hadrian did next. He wept openly, something Roman emperors simply did not do. He declared Antinous a god. He ordered statues of him erected across the entire empire, more statues than exist of most actual emperors. He founded a city in Egypt and named it Antinopolis. He created a cult, a religion, a legacy. Romans were deeply uncomfortable with this, not with the relationship that had been unremarkable, but with the grief, with the loss of control, with an emperor who loved someone so much that losing them had broken him publicly. That was what Rome couldn't process. The love itself, fine. The visible devastation of a powerful man, that was the scandal. Elagabalus. And finally, Elagabalus, the emperor who came closest to breaking every Roman rule at once. Elagabalus ruled from 218 to 222 AD. He was 14 years old when he became emperor, and within a few years he had married a male athlete, reportedly taken the passive role openly and without shame, and, according to ancient sources, offered vast rewards to any physician who could give him female anatomy. The Roman Senate was scandalized in a way that went beyond infamia. beyond mere disgrace. This was an emperor openly, publicly abandoning everything it meant to be a Roman man, everything it meant to be a vir. In 222 AD, he was assassinated. He was 18 years old. His body was thrown in the Tiber River. Rome had a limit, and Elagabalus found it. For 400 years, Rome operated under this system. Brutal, hierarchical, deeply unequal, but consistent. Your power determined your freedom. The powerful did as they pleased. The powerless had no say. And then, in the 3rd century AD, the empire began to crack. Military crises, economic collapse, plague. A century of instability so severe that Rome had over 50 emperors in 50 years, most of them dying violently. The empire that had seemed eternal was suddenly looking very mortal. Into that anxiety came Christianity. Christianity was not the first religion to spread through Rome, and it was not immediately powerful. But it offered something Rome desperately needed in a time of chaos, a moral absolute. A clear line between right and wrong that didn't depend on your status in society, rich or poor, citizen or slave, Roman or foreigner. The same rules applied to everyone. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. The empire began to shift, not overnight. Rome was too large, too ancient, too complex for that, but the direction was set. In 390 AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree. It is preserved in the Theodosian Code. And what it said was this: men who took the passive role in sex with other men were to be punished by burning alive. Read that slowly. Burning alive. In less than a century, Rome had moved from a world where Hadrian could openly grieve for Antinous and build him a city, and to a world where the act itself carried the death penalty. This was not just a change in law. It was a complete transformation of how Rome understood the human body, desire, and identity. For the first time, the question was not about your role. It was not about your status. It was about who you desired. The modern concept of sexual identity, the idea that who you're attracted to defines something fundamental about who you are, did not come from ancient Rome. It came from this moment, from the church reshaping Roman law, from a new moral framework replacing an old hierarchical one. And in a strange historical irony, the empire that had been most permissive for the powerful became the legal foundation for centuries of persecution for everyone. Rome is a mirror. Not the mirror we usually hold it up to be, not a story of noble senators and virtuous warriors. The real Rome was a place where your freedom depended entirely on your power, where love was permitted for the powerful and irrelevant for the powerless, where the scandal was never about who you loved, but whether that love cost you your status. And then it all changed, not because Rome became kinder, but because Rome adopted a new set of rules, and those rules drew a different line. History is never as simple as we learn it. The past is not a story of progress moving in one direction. Sometimes things open, sometimes they close, sometimes what looks like freedom is built on someone else's chains. If this video changed how you see Rome or how you see the past, consider subscribing. Every week we find the history that didn't make it into the textbooks, the stories that are stranger, darker, and more complicated than anything you were taught in school. And drop a comment. What surprised you the most? Because I read every single one.